In this lesson, we'll continue to develop the organic look of our concept by applying some tree bark textures. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here we have our forest creature concept once again, and in between lessons, I continue to bring over some more of that wood grain texture and just basically finished out the screen right horn as well as that little stump right there on the top of his head. And so I'm really liking how these horns are looking so far. Just adding that texture really adds a lot more detail and interest to the overall look of our character. And again, we're kind of going for a more organic look and feel with all of these additional textures that we bring in. And so now we want to go ahead and kind of focus on kind of the upper shoulder areas. You'll notice that in the sketch I kind of have these little shapes, these little patches that I've loosely sketched in, as well as these kind of protruding shapes, kind of these sharded looking shapes poking out of his shoulder areas. And so I'm imagining all of this as being very much like tree bark in appearance. So let's go ahead and have a look at a couple of textures that we're going to pull from. Okay, so here's a great example of some tree bark. It has a wonderful texture. We got some really nice grooves in there, and I think it'll work nicely. And I also like that the lighting situation is very similar to what we have over here, just with the direction of the light. Now let's go ahead and look at this second image, also of some tree bark, and this is an example of just a little bit different texture. There looks what appears to be like some moss maybe on that bark, and the bark itself feels kind of wet and moist. So this will kind of give us a nice variety to pull from, more than just one image itself this time. So let's go ahead and we're going to jump back to that initial image here, and I'm just going to go ahead and take my lasso tool, and I'll just make a selection, and we'll just pull this bark over. Okay, great. Go ahead and move that out of the way temporarily. Okay, and you'll notice that I brought this in, and it's within our new group in our texture blocking group titled Bark Patches. So we're just going to basically be bringing in these little patches of bark. So I'm just going to hit Control T on my keyboard. Let's go ahead and size up this bark, and we'll kind of start with this nice interesting shape that I have right here. And while I do this, I'm going to kind of approach it very similar to how I did with the horns. I may want to lower the opacity just a little bit here. And let's go ahead and zoom in while we're at it. And I'm going to go ahead and right-click once again. We'll go ahead and start to kind of warp this, just as we've done with that wood grain texture. And I'm just kind of bending it, I'm manipulating this texture up a little bit just to kind of set on that top facing plane of that protruding shape. We can kind of go ahead and examine that, and I think we'll go ahead and commit to that change. Okay, cool. So you'll notice that when I made these protruding shapes, I really didn't spend a whole lot of time really fleshing out any kind of grooves to establish that they are bark. I was going to kind of leave that up to the texture themselves. So what I'm going to do now is just grab my eraser tool, still with the opacity lowered, and I'm just going to kind of erase away just some of the areas that I don't really need. So right now I'm just using a hard round brush on my eraser, set to transfer in the settings in the brush panel. We can kind of just start to weave this texture in. I'm liking how that's looking so far. We may bring up our opacity all the way up. Excellent. So I'm really liking just making kind of a quick comparison there. I actually like the overall shape very nicely. Now I could kind of come in here, and we could kind of start to cut away a little bit more just to make the shape a little bit more interesting and to kind of fit our overall top-facing plane. But for the time being, that's looking very nice. Let's go ahead and pull an additional piece of bark. We'll just go ahead and continue to use the same image for the time being. Okay, and just like before, we'll bring that over. And let's go ahead and kind of jump to the opposite side here. So again, we're going to go ahead and free transform this. We'll scale this up. And again, since we are kind of scaling some of these up, making some of them smaller, and as I mentioned this in the previous lessons, as you gather textures, try to have the images be pretty high in resolution. That way, if you make any manipulations, you're not going to lose too much quality that's at least noticeable. All right. So we'll go ahead and kind of bring down the opacity here just a little bit. I'm just kind of trying to get an overall look and feel for this texture before I kind of start to manipulate it up a little bit. Okay, and then I'm just going to go ahead and lower the opacity a little bit more here. Just grabbing my eraser tool, and again, just kind of weaving away the outer edges of this texture that I don't really need. So we're not going to go through every single little piece of bark that we bring over into the bust of this concept, but we'll just kind of cover a few areas here. And then I encourage you just in between lessons to really pull from both of these images and work in these textures just kind of to your own liking. Again, think about lighting consistency, stuff like that. So now I'm just kind of starting to conform this texture just kind of to that top facing plane that I have established here. And that's starting to set in there rather nicely. I'm liking how that's looking. Now, one thing that you can do is you can use an adjustment layer to kind of adjust your overall values. Again, the reason I'm working in grayscale with all these textures is just kind of establish my values first before I get into any kind of coloring, okay? Now, as I've stressed before, this isn't the be-all, end-all way to incorporate textures into your concept. It's just one way if you really want to focus on your values first. And often I'll do this just if I'm painting something here in Photoshop. I even have a course where we just paint something entirely in grayscale and then use some blend modes to color it later on, preserving our values. But what we can do on this particular layer containing that texture we just brought over, I can come down here to the bottom of our layers panel, and you'll see this little circle that looks like it's split in half. So I'll just go ahead and click on that, and we can basically choose from just some of these different options here to add an adjustment layer. So I may want to try brightness and contrast, or levels, or even curves. So let's go ahead and try brightness and contrast. Now, I don't want it to affect everything beneath this adjustment layer, so I'm just going to add a clipping mask. I'm just right-clicking again, and I'm choosing Create Clipping Mask, which is about 3/4 of the way down there. And you'll notice it puts that little arrow there signifying this. So what's cool about adjustment layer is that you can always double click on it and come back in here and adjust it at any time you wish. Now what I am going to do just really quick is let's zoom in here. And then we'll go ahead and jump back to our adjustment layer. And I may want to increase the contrast or the brightness up a little bit. So just kind of looking at that, we may want to kind of tweak that a little bit more. And we can always, again, make kind of a comparison to what I was kind of visualizing the overall lighting situation in that particular area just based off of my sketch. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and try a sample from that other tree bark, kind of that more moist looking, kind of wet looking tree bark that we have. So I'm going to grab my lasso tool again, jump over to that image. And so again, this just has a really interesting kind of texture that I think will work pretty cool. We may want to kind of work that into one of these kind of patchy areas on our subject here of our forest creature. I may want to actually grab this area right here that kind of has a little bit of a crack running through it. I think that looks kind of cool. Okay, and we're just kind of resizing here. And let's go ahead and free transform that. And I may want to kind of work it in kind of right over here. Actually, let's kind of get this top facing plane right there. I kind of think that'll work nicely. So there's no real science to how and where you place these different types of tree bark. It's just kind of experimenting really at this point, trying to get a feel of what you think works nicely in a particular area. So I'm just kind of lowering the opacity once again, just so I can kind of see through it just faintly. And I'm just kind of coming through and erasing away just some of these different areas. So yeah, this is a very destructive edit, as we bring in each one of these textures, just erasing away. But I don't really mind that so much because I can always come back to these images and just all day long grab more and more pieces. So I'm kind of liking how that's looking right there. Just kind of starting to weave that in there nicely. Very good, very nice. Okay, so in between lessons, I'm just going to continue on with this same process, just sampling from these two images and just bringing over additional little patches of bark just into his entire kind of shoulder areas here of just this overall bust that we're working on for this concept. So I encourage you to do the same thing in between lessons and just kind of play around with some adjustment layers too, and really trying to kind of get your values where you want them to be, to where if there's a certain area that's feeling a little bit too blown out or a little bit too bright, you may want to play around with either brightness and contrast or use levels or curves. So in this case, we could even play around with the levels if we wanted to. So just bringing that up. And we could just kind of play around with some of these different sliders here to really kind of adjust our values. And of course, you want to maybe set that to a clipping mask so you're only affecting that texture. So you kind of see right there, just kind of playing around with some of those different sliders. We can bring our whites way up or bring them down. Or we could bring our blacks and bring them down a little bit more too. Okay? So we'll continue on with this process, bringing in these patches of bark. It's kind of a tedious process, but again, I encourage you to do the same thing in between lessons. So in the next lesson, we're going to start painting in a couple of different types of moss. This is going to look really cool as we start to weave this moss in with these textures that we've already included thus far, really pushing that earthy looking appearance, that very organic appearance to our fantasy forest creature concept. So stick around and we'll see you in the next lesson.